So we'll move into the afternoon portion of the workshop, and I'm really pleased to introduce Keith Van Ryswyk, who's a senior air pollution researcher in the Air Pollution Exposure and Science section of Health Canada, and also working on a PhD at the University of Toronto. And Keith's probably Mr. Air Quality Transportation, not just in Canada but in the world, really an expert on exposures in transportation. And so we're really pleased to have him here today, and he's going to be talking about characterization and mitigation of air pollution in public transit, a study that was conducted in the major cities of Canada. So, Keith.
Thanks for that generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Van Ryswyk of the Air Pollution Exposure Science section in Health Canada's Water and Air Quality Bureau. For several years, we've been conducting research in our group on trying to better understand air pollution in Canadian transit environments, as well as its mitigation. And I'm happy to discuss this topic with you today. I just wanted to say thank you to the BC Lung Foundation for the invitation. Let's see. Great. So two of the guiding questions that BC Lung sent me to design this talk. The first surrounding how does air pollution exposure levels compare between methods. And I think active transit stands out in a particular fashion in that regard, and we'll discuss that. But beyond that, there's a lot of complexities in these comparisons, so there isn't a lot of consensus. And I'll finish with discussing our research on improving air quality in public transit methods. So active transit methods, you are increasing the amount of time you're spending in the commuting environment. Typically this environment is in close proximity to traffic sources. You don't have a protective shell like a car cabin or a bus to protect yourself from the amount of air pollution that you're being exposed to. There's no filtration, so and as well, inherent in this transit method is increased breathing rates. So you're increasing your exposure and your dose. But in terms of the amount of, there's been a lot of consensus on review articles on this question. And indeed, while you are increasing the dosage of traffic-related air pollution, the health benefits of the physical activity inherent to this method outweigh the increased risks of the increased dose. But beyond that, comparing air pollution exposure across transit methods is very complicated. Indeed, many publications have been dedicated to this question, and there isn't a lot of consensus. And the reason as to why, the answer lies, the devil's in the details. There is a lot of factors that determine the amount of air pollution that a public transit method has, or excuse me, a transit method has. From one country to another, there could be very different standards of emission for buses, the filtration type that they use in buses and subways, the design of subway systems, how much ventilation there is in the system. So when you look across the landscape of publications dedicated to comparing the air pollution of these levels, I think, there definitely isn't a lot of consensus. One other interesting factor that I've found in my research is looking at how some countries have federal indoor air quality acts where they publish standards for air quality in public indoor spaces like bus stations and subway stations, and they've definitely had an impact on how those systems rank in terms of air quality across the country or across the world. The start of our examination into air quality in Canadian transit environments began with the Urban Transportation Exposure Study. We assessed air quality in 3 transit methods. For each transit method, we focused on 3 cities. We did Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal for private vehicles and rail transit, and we did Vancouver and Toronto in Ottawa. We did bus transit in Vancouver, Toronto, and Ottawa. We examined a number of pollutants, and our main research objectives were first to do a system-wide characterization. So we designed our sampling strategy to involve all of the subway systems, a large cross-section of the bus routes in each city, and a large proportion of the city's road networks. We also wanted to identify determinants of these exposures. The idea is that based on this, we could generate future research questions to target mitigative strategies to improve air quality, particularly in public transit. And finally, we wanted to know how much daily air pollution exposure a person could get from their time spent in the commuting environment. First, I'll talk about one of the questions we asked in the bus transit portion of our study. We conducted an analysis where we wanted to know how much a bus's own propulsion system impacted the exposure of its patrons. And so for all of the bus commuting we conducted in the Toronto, Vancouver, and Ottawa, you can see that in the bottom right, we categorized each bus as a pre-2004 diesel. That's a make year. In 2004, there was the introduction of, the pre-2004 buses was our reference condition, because in 2004, there was increase in the introduction of emission standards that we thought would impact potentially the air quality inside the buses. And then there was our 2004, 2006 make years, and then our post-2007 bus make years. And this is on account of, in 2007, the introduction of technologies which would yield a tenfold improvement in emission standards. This had to do with diesel particulate filters and selective catalytic reduction systems. And we also had, each bus fleet had a portion of hybrid diesel electric, and Vancouver was unique in that it was the only one that had an electric bus propulsion system. So these are the trolley buses that we see from time to time driving around the city. Our results were that indeed there was an association between a bus's propulsion system and its own air quality. We found that the 2007 further diesel bus class had lower PM2.5, black carbon, and ultrafine particles in all three cities, with the exception of ultrafine particles in Vancouver, so 8 of the 9 combinations. And this evidence, while it's interesting because these emission standards are designed to improve ambient air quality, but indeed there was a benefit to bus transit patrons as well. It reduced their exposure while they were transiting. But also it kind of suggested that buses, indeed, their own air pollution is sourced from their own exhaust. So typically the tailpipes are in the back, out the roof, but still there's infiltration happening of its own exhaust into its own bus system. The other interesting finding, was the proportion of daily fine fraction barium exposure and fine fraction iron exposure. These two elements, as we've learned today, definitely related to brake dust. But the 60 to 70% of the daily exposure to fine fraction barium and iron was coming from a person's bus transit, and this was a fairly accurate estimate for all three cities. So it's kind of a unique exposure profile, bus commuting, high exposure to diesel exhaust and brake dust. And moving forward, what is the future of air pollution exposure going to look like in bus transit systems in Canada? Well, we're at the beginning of a huge influx of electric propulsion buses in a number of public transit authorities across the country. This is definitely going to change the landscape. A huge elimination of the amount of diesel exhaust exposure, but also to potentially brake dust on account of these buses having regenerative braking systems. And I would love it if someone here knew at what kilometers per hour regenerative braking quits and friction braking kicks in. Because in subways, it's 5 kilometers per hour, but I don't know what it is for buses, and nobody else does here. I should have learned that. That would have been a good part of the presentation. But if it is like subways, at 5 kilometers per hour, it switches from regenerative to friction braking, that's going to be a huge decrease in the amount of brake dust being produced. And a lot of this influx of electric propulsion buses is being pushed by the Zero Emission Transit Fund introduced by Infrastructure Canada, so to provide subsidies for the purchase of zero emission buses, or ZEBs as they like to call it. And I've got a list of public transit authorities that have made plans to purchase these types of buses and replace their retiring diesels with electric buses. Now on to subways. So this is the box plot you see to the right there. This is the data from the Urban Transportation Exposure Study. You see Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver from the left to the right, each box with a color corresponding to the transit method. For Montreal, you can see that, and this is PM 2.5, excuse me. For Montreal, you can see relatively, not different exposures of PM 2.5 between the private vehicle and the subway system. Very different in Toronto, where we see significant higher levels of PM 2.5 for subways relative to buses and private cars. But there's also an extra element of the subway systems here. The below grade and the above grade. So above grade subways in Toronto, that's about 20% of the system, where 80% is below grade. And in Vancouver, it's kind of the opposite for that. But we see this same trend where we have significantly higher PM 2.5 levels in the below grade portions of the subway systems of Vancouver and Toronto relative to other modes. And if you'll take note of the y-axis, these are high levels of PM 2.5 in these environments. And this was the piece of evidence that led us, as we've slowly been developing, the conclusion that there is a high concentration of PM 2.5 and PM 10 in the below grade rail lines in the world, particularly the ones that are unventilated. Because as you can see, the Montreal subway PM 2.5 levels, it's on par with the other transit systems. This is part of the complexity I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation, but we'll talk about the difference later on in the presentation. But our next study was also in this study, as I said, we wanted to estimate the proportion of daily exposure that came from commuting. For subways, for Toronto, it's 21.2% of daily PM 2.5 coming from subway commuting. So that's 4.9% of your day for these 500,000 commuters. And the 4.9% comes from the Canadian Human Activity Pattern Survey. But we estimated basically a fifth of daily PM 2.5 exposure coming from subway commuting for Toronto. Much less for Montreal and Vancouver. Montreal owing to its significantly lower PM 2.5, which I'll discuss in a minute, and Vancouver being predominantly above grade. But also a very different profile of elemental content of a person's PM 2.5. It's a bit of an interesting anecdote. Around 1999, there were some researchers from Research Triangle Park who wanted to take a look at the personal PM 2.5 chemical composition of PM 2.5 for Torontonians. They recruited 992 people, and they sampled them for 3 days, and they wanted to know what their manganese level was like, because they were concerned with the MMT additive to fuel that was allowed in Canada. But there was this subset of their participants at these really, really high levels of manganese, and it took them a while to figure out where that was coming from, and indeed they were subway commuters. But all in all, our findings of the first study was that subway commuting could contribute significantly to daily exposure and produce a unique profile of PM 2.5, which may be a concern. Now Montreal, why so low? Continual mechanical ventilation, the heat buildup in the Montreal system is quite high, and it needs to be regulated, or it would be impossible for people to take the subway because it would be too hot. This is also the case for a lot of other systems in warmer climates. The Barcelona subway system, many others. They need continual ventilation to maintain thermal comfort levels, and the benefit of that very expensive measure is that the air quality of those systems is pretty good. I had somebody from the municipal government in Montreal call me once and ask about my research, and because they wanted to institute or push for monitoring in the system, and I said, the air quality in the Montreal system is amazing. I'm sorry. Let me know if you want to do something in below grade unventilated subway environments. Here's a very interesting publication that came out from Dr. Moreno of the Spanish National Research Council. She published every measured level of PM 2.5 in platforms across the world. And indeed, you see a lot of variability there. But there wasn't a lot of below-grade unventilated subway systems in the literature when this was published. And based on research that's been published since, we have a lot of these types of systems that have levels far beyond this range. And they're also highly rich in iron oxides. Basically, this is the finding that's coming out with me and some other researchers from these systems who've published these papers, that extensively below-grade rapid transit rail systems can significantly increase the daily PM2.5 exposures of its patrons, which number in the millions. One of the publications based on the London Underground estimated that 1 hour, every 1 hour in the subway system would increase a person's daily PM2.5 by 12 micrograms per cubic meter, which is a clinically significant level. But the composition, what is that, Matt? Moving forward, we went back to Toronto. We did some sampling at 11 platforms throughout the system. We wanted to know what interventions would impact the level of PM2.5 in the system. Our results, what we found, vacuuming didn't work because they had introduced a track bed vacuum car. It didn't remove any of the PM2.5. The newly opened section in the northwest of line 1, that's the top left of the image there, we sampled within a year of it being introduced. It had levels typical of older stations that were 60 years old in under a year. This is all kind of pointing towards freshly emitted PM being the predominant form. Another thing is on line 2, the green line, levels increased by 49% line-wide. And we found out that this had to do with an issue they were having with the signaling systems for braking. Trains use regenerative braking. They switch to friction at 5 kilometers per hour, unless they've passed a certain marker where, in that case, the friction brakes engage. And so we had a lot more brake dust, a lot more steel dust on that line when we were down there, which is also interesting. Looking at the composition, we're looking at 75% iron oxides of all the PM2.5 in line 1 and line 2 in the Toronto subway system. And there's similar elemental profiles of other extensively below grade systems that are unventilated. But what does this mean for health effects? A high content of fine fraction iron oxides and steel source elements. Well, one, sources, most of the PM in the system is from the system itself. Therefore, it can be controlled and mitigated. And we need to look into methods to do that. But what does it mean for health effects? That's a whole other research question that needs to be answered as well. But I did hear somebody today say something along the lines of, it doesn't matter what it's made of, it's all bad. No? All right. The main components that produce the PM in the subway system, frame A, top left, you've got your rails, you have your third rail electrification system, the red line, and then your main rails. You also have brake pads, as well as the steel wheels themselves. So about 5 different sources that we've been looking into in the Toronto system. And we've conducted chemical mass balance modeling to try and understand the apportionment between 2 sources. One, the Fe-dominated components, the rails, the contact shoes, and the wheels, over 94% iron. So basically one big source of iron. And then the brake shoes, they have a higher content of barium. So one other or a couple of other elemental species that make them distinct from the iron-dominated sources. And line 1's at the top, nice normal operation, friction brakes engaging at 5 kilometers per hour, very low proportion of the PM coming from the brake shoes, most coming from the steel components. But in line 2, as I said, there was that issue with the high rate of friction brake use and wheel flats. When you have a steel wheel and you get a flat section because of continual rubbing on the rail, it needs to be trued and fixed. But there was a huge rate, that was happening at a huge rate in 2018 when we were in the system. But as you can see, because of the friction brake use, a lot more PM and a lot more from brakes. So that's where we stand. The other activity that we've been doing is we've published a guidance document on managing air quality in subway systems. This was published a year ago. It was based on a massive literature review that we conducted, and we had 4 main things that we advised to be done to improve air quality in below-grade subway systems. 1, forced ventilation systems. That's a very expensive measure. Other systems do it because they absolutely have to for thermal comfort. But can other systems that don't need it for thermal comfort, could they possibly consider it? Next, in-train filtration. So higher grade MERV filtration systems. That's rather than focusing filtration efforts on platforms where patrons spend less of their time and there's a far greater airspace to manage there. So in-train filtration, monitoring subway air quality, an excellent idea throughout a system. The high rate of PM production in Line 2 in Toronto, that could have been seen right away. Like, it's such a sharp increase. And indeed, when they fixed the results and we went and did sampling again, it all came down typical to Line 1 levels very, very quickly. So they could get ahead of problems having to do with mechanical issues that cause PM and were very expensive. And reducing subway PM emissions. So how much does the rail weigh before it's used? How much does it weigh when you have to replace it? Same thing for the wheels, same for the brake shoes. Basically the kind of analysis that we would love to do. So they can isolate which of the steel-dominated components is producing the most PM and then explore mitigative efforts there. The things we said that might not be a great idea: one, platform screen doors. Definitely install them for public safety, absolutely. But they really do concentrate the PM emission inside the tunnel so it more readily infiltrates into the trains. I was able to work with some researchers from Copenhagen University at the end of last year on one of their publications of the Copenhagen subway system. Very interesting situation. Complete loop, completely below grade, complete platform screen doors, and it's only one of the few systems in the world where the in-train levels are higher than the platform levels. And also some longitudinal research that was done in the Seoul Metropolitan Subway System. They had data before and after the installation, the complete installation of PSDs throughout the system, and indeed it increased in-train levels. And vacuuming and washing, based on our research and research done elsewhere, it doesn't seem to be very effective at improving air quality. I don't know where it's going. I think it's all going into the coarse mode and settling, but the PM is being generated on a daily basis. If you were to sweep away all of the PM, it would just come back in a short time frame, and that's what we see. In our study, Copenhagen and Stockholm, with a newly opened independent below-grade section, PM gets really high very fast. So in summary, active transit, in terms of the comparison of modes, the benefit of physical activity outweigh health risks of increased exposure. Comparisons across modes are very, very complicated beyond that. Improving air quality in public transit, reducing emission of traffic-related air pollution is definitely key for all modes. The electrification of bus fleets that's being planned in the future is definitely going to change the landscape of air quality in buses. And lastly, air pollution in below-grade rail transit systems. It seems to be a particular unique problem of its own that solutions are possible. We have increasing infrastructure of below-grade subway systems in many cities in Canada. And if indeed mechanical ventilation systems, which do exist because they're mandated by Transport Canada, if they can be utilized to maintain some threshold level, that would be pretty great. These are all my colleagues that I've been working with on this topic. At the end of last September at ISES 2022, we had the unique experience of researchers from many of these types of systems that I've been talking about coming together, conducting a symposium on this air quality issue. And I think our best KT approach is an international one. I think there's a lot of links between the public transit authorities across the globe. They share CEOs constantly. And I think that if we can get their ear on this potential problem, on this real problem, but the potential solutions to it, maybe we would be able to, because each of us have a relationship with the public transit authority, one or two of them, and they're very busy. They're concerned with public perception very, very much, and that makes a lot of sense. And they get a lot of flack from the public about how their system's being managed. It's very hard for them to think long term, especially about air quality. There are no standards in this environment for Canada, for many countries, and so there's no force. All that exists are occupational ones, and they're a milligram per cubic meter. There's no occupational standard for PM 2.5. So there's no reason for them to, well, what I'm suggesting, which many are suggesting, do the very, very expensive intervention of using mechanical ventilation. Anyways, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Keith. Really great presentation. I told you for transportation air quality. Lots of time for questions, please.
Oh, no, I can hear you. Owen?
Yeah, maybe wait so that everybody
Okay.
can hear.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering, in terms of that mechanical ventilation or forced ventilation with those below grade systems, obviously that PM 2.5 is going somewhere that's
Okay.
not in there. So is it creating like big pockets of pollution above ground somewhere?
Okay, that's a great question.
Just where is it going?
I have two answers. The Seoul Metropolitan Subway system, so they have a federal Indoor Air Quality Act. They have standards for their subway platforms, and they maintain them by using mechanical ventilation. But the vents at ground level, they've explored research ideas around using magnetic filtration to make sure that the particles don't get released into the air. And I think that's clever, and I think that's worthy of their time, absolutely. But I feel like venting these particles into a larger airspace would create a net benefit. That's a good question. Thank you.
Other questions?
Can you take a question from online?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we have one from Greg Batelan asking about radon gas. His question is, do you know if Toronto and Montreal subway tunnels have ever been tested for radon?
I'm sorry, no, I don't. If there's occupational standards for radon, which I believe there are, then they are being tested because these environments are regularly tested for occupational limits. Thank you for your question.
I'll ask one. And maybe you covered it, but are there any systems that actually have in-cabin filtration?
All cabins are filtered.
So,
Yeah, and before the pandemic, the Toronto Transit Commission was using MERV 8s in its trains, but it's switched to MERV 13s. And we've done some monitoring, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact that has
we
on.
don't know what reductions.
Due to that switch?
Yeah.
Not yet. Yeah.
You're quick. Just to add on to that question, in those discussions of sort of higher MERV rating filtration, does energy ever come into it? Sort of with the health and air quality and then the energy consumption for the higher MERV?
Yeah, the most research that's been done on investigating the potential of mechanical ventilation to improve subway air quality has been in the Seoul Metropolitan Subway system, and a lot of their work has been done to ensure that it's used as efficiently as possible because, yes, there is a huge energy demand. Models that take into account time of day, ridership, outdoor levels, because it is very expensive, as systems like Montreal and Barcelona know. One other point I wanted to make that I was kind of thinking about here during your talk, Dr. Bauer, is the health impacts of PM 2.5 could be dependent on the air pollution mixture that they're part of, and that could definitely play a role in the subway systems because there's no O3. There's very, very little O3 because there isn't the sunlight to drive its production, and the NO2 levels are low as well on account of there being no traffic sources and little infiltration of the street level NO2 down into the system. So because of that unique composition, but also the unique mixture, the health effects of subway air quality are it's a big research question that people are working on. But we decided to take the approach of all the levels are higher, they could be lower, so we should do research on how to mitigate it. The precautionary principle there. Okay.
I'll ask one more.
Please.
So as you probably know, we're extending our system in Vancouver, and I remember bringing up this issue at the design phase, and I think mostly everything was ignored. But if you had to have the ear of a transit authority for like a new, let's say an extension of a largely below grade, what would your advice be as you right now?
That's a great question. You're designing how to design a below grade. You've already made the decision to go below grade because it's not feasible to disturb all of the real estate value above. I think that's what the decision is. Really, I think The ventilation is the key, the filtration in the trains is the key, but how air quality stacks up and all the other considerations on how to design a rail public transit system that's a difficult question. Yeah.
Final question for the audience? And before you go, I have a gift for you, and thanks very much for your presentation.